Subscribe for free today.
Chapter 1 of The Amazing Stories of Letitia Carberry by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Amazing Adventures of Letitia Carberry. Chapter 1. What Happened to Johnson? Strictly speaking, this is Tish's story, but Tish is unable to write it, being laid up, as you probably know from the newspapers. But we all three felt that a record of the affair ought to be kept while it was fresh in our minds, although goodness knows we're not likely to forget any of it. A good many people wondered when the story came out how Tish had come to be mixed up with it at all. But as Tish herself says, it was very simple. The people at the hospital had become demoralized, and some firm hand had to take hold. Besides, Tish was a member of the ladies' committee and felt responsible. Tish says the first thing she knew about it was a piercing scream just outside her room. This was followed by a number of short, sharp cries, feminine, and steps running past her bedroom door. Now, as Tish also remarks with truth, one hears a variety of strange sounds in a hospital at night, and at first she thought it was the woman across the hall, who had had her appendix removed that afternoon, and who had been very unpleasant as a neighbour all evening. But when the noise kept up, and only died away to be followed by somebody crying hysterically down the hall, Tish was roused. She sat up in bed and threw her small travelling clock at Miss Lewis. Miss Lewis was Tish's nurse, a splendid woman, but a heavy sleeper. She slept on a cot in the room, and until Tish learned that it did not hurt the clock to throw it, she had been obliged to ring for one of the night nurses to come in and waken her. So now she threw the clock. Miss Lewis picked the clock from off her chest and sat up, yawning, to look at it. 20 minutes after 1, Miss Carberry, she said. Would you like some buttermilk? Now, Tish was not really ill. She was taking a rest cure last autumn while her apartment was being painted and papered, and while she recovered from a twisted knee. She'd bought a second-hand automobile some months before and learned to run it herself, and the knee was the result of her being thrown out over the steering wheel and 10 feet beyond the potato wagon she had collided with. Although, as Tish says, it is a strange thing that her knee was twisted when she brought up standing on her head in 3 inches of muddy water and a family of tadpoles. Both Aggie and I went to see her daily, the 3 of us being old friends, although not related. And she was always glad to see us, although she grew sarcastic when Aggie casually remarked that except for the meeting of the Anti-Vivisection Society, we might also have been flung over the potato wagon. Well. "Would you like some buttermilk?" asked Miss Lewis again, beginning to draw on her kimono. Tish says that provoked her and she reached for the clock again, but of course Miss Lewis had it in her hand. "No," she snapped. "Go out in the hall and see what has happened." Miss Lewis yawned again and groped around in the half light for her slippers. It was more than Tish could stand. She hopped out of bed in her bare feet and limped to the door. The hall was almost dark, and across it the woman with the appendix, or without, was groaning. But halfway along, where the night nurse has her desk and keeps her papers, and where the annunciator for the patient's bells is fastened to the wall, Tish saw a group of 5 or 6 nurses gathered about somebody in a chair. One of them came running past with a glass of something, and the crowd opened to admit the girl and the glass, and closed again. Miss Lewis came and looked over Tish's shoulder. "Gee!" she said, and ran down the hall with her slippers flapping and her braids switching from side to side. Just then the woman across gave another groan, and it being dark and the scream still echoing in her ears, Tish reached inside the door for her cane and hobbled out in her nightgown. The girl in the chair, she said, was as white as milk, and her lips were blue. She was half lying with her head against the back of the chair, and a violent shudder now and then was the only sign of life about her. One of the other nurses was stroking her hands and talking to her in a soothing tone. "Now listen, Miss Blake," she said. "It couldn't be. We all have these queer feelings here. It's the nervous strain and loss of sleep. I'll never forget the first time I had to do it." "Nor I," said another girl. "I went with you. Do you remember? It was that dwarf that died in J. We'd forgotten something and you had to go and leave me alone." "Hush!" another nurse broke in, and Miss Blake began to shudder again. "If we had some hot coffee for her. Will you drink some coffee if we make it, Miss Blake?" The girl in the chair shook her head, and Miss Lewis dragged one of the nurses from the group and whispered to her. Tish heard part of the answer. "Went up with Linda Smith, and as usual Linda forgot something. She's been overworking. Went to raise the window for fresh air. She says she heard a sound, but didn't notice it. When she turned around, then more whispering that Tish couldn't catch." "No," Miss Lewis said, and looked queer herself. "Then if it's true, it is still—" "Yes." Miss Blake sat up just then and tried to wipe her blue lips with her handkerchief, but her hands shook so that one of the nurses did it for her. She mopped the girl's pallid forehead too, and put her arm over her shoulders protectingly. "You're going off duty, girl," she said. "About all the hard work in the place has been falling to you lately, and if we don't take care we will be minus the class flower." Tish says the girl tried to smile at that and was very pretty. I can answer for her looks myself, having seen her often enough later. She had soft, wavy black hair and Irish blue eyes, and she was rather small. Partly for that, and partly because she was so young, we fell into the way of calling her the little nurse. But to go back to Tish's story. "You're sure you didn't doze off?" one of the little girls asked, pressing forward. But the little nurse shook her head. "Asleep. There," she said in a low voice. "Could you?" "What enrages me," Miss Lewis burst out, glaring at the group through her glasses, "is why Linda Smith left her there alone." "She forgot something," said Miss Blake. "She usually forgets something," Miss Lewis began. "When she dies, Linda'll forget—" "Hush!" somebody whispered. "Here she is." Miss Smith came quickly along the hall, her arms full of bundles. She stopped when she saw the group and ran her eye over it. "Well," she said, "what is it? Fudge?" One of the girls detached herself from the group and started for her. Miss Smith was a tall, raw-boned woman with short, curly hair and a rugged but good-natured face, and Tish says she stood smiling at them. "I suppose you know," she said, "the spiritualist from K has passed over. Didn't want to go, poor old man. Said he had 3 wives waiting in the spirit world." The other girl came up to her then and caught her by the elbow and whispered to her. Tish was standing in the shadow, leaning on her cane, and she didn't know from Adam what was the matter, but she was covered with goose flesh. "Nonsense," said Miss Linda Smith suddenly. "She's been dozing." Miss Blake got up and steadied herself by the back of the chair, looking across at the other woman. "I'm afraid not, Miss Smith," she said. "You remember when the orderlies carried up poor old Johnson? They laid him on the table in the mortuary, didn't they?" "Yes," said Miss Smith, half smiling. "They usually do. They don't generally throw him out the window." Miss Blake clutched the chair tighter, Tish says, and her lips trembled. "I want you to come with me and see," she said. "We covered the body with a sheet, didn't we?" "Yes." Miss Smith stopped smiling. "And then you left, and I was alone. I tried not to mind. I haven't been here very long. But I was afraid, after a minute or two, that I was getting faint. I seemed to feel eyes on me." Some of the girls nodded as if they understood. "So I went to the window and threw it up to get air. Then I thought I heard something moving behind me. I felt it. like the eyes, rather than heard it. And I didn't look around at once. I couldn't. It was so far from the rest of the house, and I was alone with it. And when I turned, she stopped and moistened her lips with her tongue, and her face was ghastly. It was gone, Miss Smith. Gone. Now, Tish isn't easy to frighten, but at that moment the appendix woman gave a deep groan, and she says her heart jumped once or twice and turned over in her chest. The nurses were all standing huddled together in a little group, and one of them kept looking over her shoulder. "Gone," said Miss Smith, and sat down in a chair suddenly, as if her legs had given way. What have you done?" "Sent for Jacobs, the night watchman," one of the nurses explained. "Dr. Grimm and Dr. Sands are in the operating room, a night case, and the medical internes had a row with Mr. Harrison and left last night. We'll be in nice shape if G ward gets busy." "What's G ward?" Tish asked, edging over to Miss Lewis. "G ward," said Miss Lewis coolly. "G ward is where the stork drops that part of the population that has only half the legal number of parents." "You'll have to go back to bed, Miss Carberry." "I'll do nothing of the sort," said Tish, and glared at her. Tish told us the rest of the story the next morning, sitting propped up in bed with Aggie on one side and me on the other. We'd brought her some creamed sweetbreads, but she was so excited she could not eat. The change in her was horrible. She had passed through a crisis, and she showed it. "You'd better let us take you home, Tish," Aggie pleaded, when Tish had finished. "This is no place for a nervous woman." Tish took a mouthful of the sweetbread and made a face over it. "Heavens!" she said. "It's easy seen salt's cheap. No, I am not going home. I shall stay to see the end of this, if it's the end of me." "Listen, Tish," Aggie said miserably. "Hasn't my advice always been good? Didn't I beg you on my bended knees not to buy that automobile? Didn't both Lizzie and I protest with tears against the motor boat? And you'll carry that scar till your dying day. And now it's spirits, Tish. Don't tell me it wasn't." "Where's that Lewis woman?" was all Tish would say. "Speaking of spirits reminds me I haven't been rubbed with alcohol yet." But I'd better tell Tish's story in her own words. "Once for all, before I begin, Aggie," she ordered. Tish is a masterful woman. "You open the collar of your waist and put a pillow behind you. I'm not going to be broken in on in the middle of this by your fainting away. Faint if you want, but get ready beforehand. Lewis is not usually around when she's wanted." "I don't want to hear it if it's as bad as that," Aggie protested, opening the neck of her waist. "Lizzie, reach me that pillow." "I don't know that I want to hear it myself, Tish," I said. "You better do as Aggie says and come home. You're a wreck this morning, and I've telephoned for Tommy Andrews." Tommy is Tish's doctor, the son of her cousin, Eliza Peabody Andrews, a nice enough boy, but frivolous. He is on the visiting staff at the hospital and makes rounds once a day, I believe, with an attentive intern at his elbow and the prettiest nurse he can find carrying the order book. Tish set the sweetbread on the bedside table with a bang and looked at me for an instant over her glasses. "Don't be a fool, Lizzie," she said. "Do you think Tommy Andrews can make me do anything I don't want to? Do you think the entire connection could move me 1 foot if I didn't want to go?" "You can't spend another night here," I put in, somewhat feebly. "Can't I?" she said grimly. "Not only I can and will, but you and Aggie are going to take turns here with me, night and night about, until this is cleared up. Mark my words, last night was not the end." She turned over on her side then and proceeded to have her back rubbed with alcohol. And while Miss Lewis rubbed, she told us the story. Miss Lewis wanted me to go back to bed, she said, when she had reached that point, but I refused to go. "You needn't take the skin off, Miss Lewis." I stood there in my gown and I watched them making up their minds to go to the mortuary. That's up a narrow flight of stairs from this end of the hall, not far from this very room." Nobody was anxious to lead off, but Miss Blake seemed determined to go back and prove she hadn't been asleep, and at last they moved off, huddled in a group, and left me there. "You haven't got a spite against my right shoulder, have you?" Miss Lewis followed them. "I didn't," said Miss Lewis sourly. Tish turned and looked up at her over her shoulder. "You looked as if you were going to, and you know it," she asserted. "And don't interrupt me." Miss Lewis followed, and seeing I was going to be left alone and feeling somewhat creepy along the back, I followed her. "Really," Miss Lewis began, "we went up the staircase, and if you and Aggie go out and look, you'll see how it leads. There's a hall up there with a few private rooms along one side and a small ward across. The mortuary is up a flight of about 8 steps at the far end." The hall was dark, and all the light came from the mortuary. The door was open, and it seemed bright and cheerful enough. I was feeling pretty sure the black-haired girl had dozed and had a dream when I saw Miss Smith, who was in the lead, stoop and pick something up and hold it out to the other nurses. "That's queer," she said, and her eyes were fairly starting out of her head. "What is it?" said I, limping forward. The nurses were staring at the thing she held. "It's impossible," she muttered. But that's the bandage I tied Johnson's hands together with." "Miss Lewis, will you let Miss Pilkington sniff that alcohol for a moment?" "Fiddle!" Aggie protested feebly. "I'm not at all upset." Then she put her head back on her pillow and fainted, as Tish had arranged, with decency and order. Well, to go on, it seemed that Tish began to lose her courage about that time, and when one of the braver nurses came running back after a hasty look and said that Miss Blake was right and there was nobody in the mortuary, there was almost a stampede. And then it was, I believe, that heavy steps were heard on the staircase, and it proved to be Jacobs, the night watchman. Now, Tish was in her nightgown, and I fancy, although she never confessed it, that she fell into some sort of a panic and darted into one of the empty rooms. She herself says Miss Lewis pushed her in, out of sight, and closed the door, but Miss Lewis indignantly denies this. "I stood inside the door in the darkness," Tish said. "The night watchman was just outside, and I could hear everything that was said, plainly. He didn't believe the body was gone and said so. I heard him go toward the mortuary door, and the young women followed him. I could feel a chair just beside me, and my knee was jumping again, so I sat down. That was when I saw I'd stepped into an occupied room. There was a man in his night clothes standing not 10 feet away, in the middle of the room, and I jumped up in a hurry. "Good heavens!" I said. "I didn't know there was anybody here. You'll have to excuse me." Tish is an extraordinary woman. She was apparently quite cool, but I happened to glance at Miss Lewis, and she was pouring a small stream of alcohol into the lap of Aggie's black broadcloth tailor-made. She was a pasty yellow-white. "The man didn't say anything, although I could see him moving," Tish went on. "I thought he was rude. I got the door open and stepped into the hall, almost into the arms of the Blake girl." "Well, were you right?" I asked her. She nodded. "Absolutely gone, without a trace," she said, with a catch in her voice. "Maybe he wasn't dead," I suggested. "There's a lot of catalepsy around just now." "He was dead," she insisted. "Quite dead. He's been dying for a week." Well, what with the watchman and lights moving around, I wasn't so nervous as I had been, and I was pretty much interested. "There's one thing sure, my dear," I said. "He won't go far in that state. I'll just hobble down and get my wrapper on, and we'll have a search. I stepped into that room in my nightgown, and I dare say the man in there nearly died himself, of the shock." "The man in there?" she said. "Why, all these rooms are empty, Miss Carberry." We stood staring at each other. "There's a man in there," I repeated. "He stood up and stared at me when I went in." She got very white, but she walked right over to the door and pushed it open. I saw her throw up her hands, and the next minute she had fallen flat on her face in the doorway, and the night watchman was running towards us with a lighted candle. Tish leaned over and took a drink of water. "This bed's full of crumbs, Miss Lewis," she grumbled. "It's queer to me that the only part of this hospital toast that is crisp is the part I get in the bed." "For heaven's sake, Tish," I said impatiently. "I suppose she didn't faint because there were crumbs in your bed." "No," Tish said, hitching herself over to the other side of the mattress. "She fainted because the body of the missing spiritualist was hanging by its neck to the chandelier, fastened up with a roller towel." "Dead?" Aggie asked, opening her eyes for the first time. "Still dead," Tish replied grimly. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of The Amazing Adventures of Letitia Carberry by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Little Nurse. Aggie was really frightfully upset. Aggie is rather emotional at any time, and although she herself is a Methodist, her mother's only sister had been a believer in spiritualism. They dug her up 10 years after she died to make room for somebody else, and Aggie's mother said her hair had grown to be fully 10 feet long and was curly, whereas in life it had always been straight. We may sneer at spiritualism all we want, but things like that are hard to account for. Well, of course, Aggie declared that no human hand had strung poor old Johnson to the chandelier by a roller towel around his neck. And although Tish ridiculed the idea, she had to admit that the fourth dimension had never been accounted for, and that table levitation was an accepted fact, and even known to the ancients. We sat there gloomily enough while Miss Lewis fixed Tish's hair and massaged her knee. In the middle of the massage, Tommy Andrews came in, whistling. "Morning, Aunt Tish," he said. "Morning, Miss Aggie. Morning, Miss Lizzie. How's the knee? Looks as handsome as ever." "She's been walking on it," said Miss Lewis sourly, and giving the knee an extra jab. Tommy gave Tish a ferocious frown over his glasses. "Humph," he said. "I told you to keep off it. Miss Lewis, if she is obstreperous again, just tie her down with a half-dozen roller towels." "Roller towels!" Tish ejaculated. "Why, it was a roller towel that " "So you said," Aggie said somberly, and we stared at each other. We hardly knew why. Tish told Tommy the whole story as he strapped her knee with adhesive plaster. He hadn't heard it, and he was as much puzzled as we were. It was Aggie who remarked afterward how his face changed when Tish mentioned Miss Blake. "Blake?" he said, glancing up quickly. "Not the little nurse with the dark hair?" "Yes," Tish said. "Damn," said Tommy, "to have left her alone like that." And to Miss Lewis, "Is she ill today?" "She's in bed, but she's not sleeping," said Miss Lewis with more feeling than I'd have expected. "I was going to ask you if you would see her, doctor. Since the shake-up yesterday, we have no medical interns, and the surgical side is full up." She didn't ask for me," said Tommy, with his brown eyes kindling. But Miss Lewis shook her head. "She's hardly spoken at all. She just lies there with her eyes wide open and her face white, watching the door. An hour ago, one of the nurses pushed it open quietly for fear she was asleep. Miss Blake lay and watched it moving, and when Linda, Miss Smith, went in, she fainted again." Tommy took a turn up and down the room. "She's had a profound shock," he said. "I'm not afraid of it, unless—" He stopped at the window and stood looking out. "Unless what?" said Tish, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stalked over and rang the bell. "I'll have the hall nurse relieve you, Miss Lewis," he said. "We can't leave my aunt alone, and somebody must see to Miss Blake." There's some natural explanation for what happened last night, and we must find it and tell her." Aggie began to tell about the aunt with the hair, but before she had even buried her, the door opened and Miss Blake herself came in. "Did you ring?" she asked. She was dead white, lips and all, with deep circles around her eyes, but her step was brisk and her voice cheerful. As Tish said, if you could only have heard her and not seen her, nobody would have believed what had happened. Tommy gave her one look and hauled a chair forward. "Sit down," he ordered. "You're not fit to be on duty." "Thank you, but I am all right again," she said, hesitating. "Please sit down," said Tommy, with a note in his voice which I had never heard him use to Tish. And she took the chair, glancing around at all three of us, and then at him. "Miss Blake," he said, "I have decided to become your medical adviser." "Thanks very much," she said, with the ghost of a smile. "On one condition," he went off, polishing his glasses very hard with his handkerchief. "You will have to obey orders." "That's the first lesson in the training school," she assented, the smile deepening. "Always obey the doctor's orders." "Stuff," said Tommy sternly. "If I order you to bed this minute, you'll not go. The trouble is, Aunt Tish and honorary Aunts Lizzie and Aggie," he said, addressing us each in turn, "the trouble is that in a hospital, medicine is a drug on the market. It's too accessible. So are doctors. They're always on tap, like city water, plentiful and free, and therefore subject, like the said water, to the scorn and contumely of the beneficiaries." "Indeed, doctor," Miss Blake began, but he interrupted her. "Now, Miss Blake," he said, "at your earnest solicitation, I am about to undertake your case, and the first condition is obedience." She shot a glance at him from under her long dark lashes, and Aggie raised her eyebrows across the bed at me. "Exactly," he said. "The three aunts, actual and honorary, are witnesses. You have promised obedience. The first condition is you are to leave the hospital immediately and go to a place I know just out of town. A nice place, with a dog and kittens. No, Aunt Tish, not a cat and kittens. But Miss Blake stood up suddenly. She was paler than before. "Not that!" she said almost wildly. Tommy came over and put his hand on her shoulder. "We can dispose of the animals," he said gently. "Can't you see yourself, little girl, that you are about at the end of your string? Quiet nights, sleep, fresh milk. You won't know yourself in a week." "I cannot go," she said, and stood looking straight ahead, with such misery in her face that Aggie's eyes filled up. "You can take your vacation," Tommy persisted gently. "I'll take you out myself in my machine." "I don't want to go, doctor. I can't be spared just now. Don't send me away. Don't." She began to cry, wildly, hysterically, with her shoulders quivering and her whole body tense. I was considerably upset, and Tommy looked dumbfounded. After all, it was Miss Lewis who knew what to do. She is a large woman, and she simply took the little nurse into her arms and petted her into quiet. Finally, she coaxed her into the hall, and as the door closed behind them, the four of us sat silent. Aggie was snivelling and wiping her eyes, and Tish turned on her in a rage. "What in the name of sense are you bleating about?" she demanded. "The child's in trouble," said Aggie. "I never could see anybody cry, and you know it, Tish." "I know something else too," said Tish grimly, sliding her feet out of bed carefully and reaching for her cane. "That young woman knows more than she's telling, Tommy Andrews. We're not through with this yet." Now Tommy will always have his joke with Tish, and they differ on a good many subjects. Politics for one thing, and religion. Tommy not believing very much in a future existence, and maintaining that no medical man ought to. It made the more saving of life in this, but he has a great respect for Tish's opinion. "You may be right," he said, There must be some reason, but whatever it is, it's not to her discredit. I'll swear to that." "Listen to the boy," Tish sneered, picking up the travelling clock and putting it back on the bedside table again. "That's what a pretty face will do. Suppose it had been Lewis who stood there crying into a starched apron and saying she couldn't leave. Don't ask her." "Why should she leave when she has you, dear Aunt Letitia?" asked Tommy, and Tish reached for the clock again. "Well, we talked the thing over, but we couldn't come to any conclusion. There didn't seem to be any matter of doubt that Johnson, having died peaceably and in order, had been carried to the mortuary and laid on the table, there to await the final preparations for burial. And the fact was incontestable that shortly after, the said Johnson, as Tommy put it, was hanging by the neck to the chandelier in a room 50 feet away and down 8 steps. We all agreed up to that point. As Tommy said, the question then became simply, did he do it himself or was it done for him? Aggie was confident that he had done it himself. "Why not?" she demanded. "Isn't it the constant endeavor of the people who have passed over to come back and prove their continued existence on a spirit plane? Shall I ever forget that the third night after Mr. Wiggins died, Aggie was once engaged to a roofer who passed over by falling off a roof. Can I ever forget that a light like a flame of a candle rose in one corner of the bedroom, crossed the ceiling and disappeared in my sewing basket, where I kept Mr. Wiggins' photograph? Why should not Mr. Johnson, before deserting the earth plane for the spirit world, have come back and proved his continued existence? Why?" Tommy lighted a cigarette and puffed at it. "Well," he said, "I should call it indecent of him if he did, and bad taste too. Maybe he didn't think much of his body, but it had lasted pretty well and carried him around a good many years. And to have his spirit cast off its outer garment and hang it to a chandelier, it was heartless, heartless." End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Amazing Adventures of Letitia Carberry by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Another roller towel. Now Tish is a peculiar woman. Once she starts a thing, whether it is house cleaning or learning to roller skate, she keeps right on at it. She learned to skate backwards, you may remember, although she nearly died learning, and lay once 20 minutes insensible on the back of her head. And as Tish acknowledged later, she had made up her mind to find out who or what had hung Johnson by the neck to the chandelier. So after Tommy had gone, she got into her roller chair and asked me to ring for Miss Lewis. "What time do you go to your lunch?" she asked her sharply when she came. "I don't eat lunch," said Miss Lewis. "Why?" "It's making me stout. Besides, there's never anything fit to eat." Said Tish. "I guess the meals provided in this training school are above the average. I myself engaged the housekeeper. You'd better have lunch today." "But at 12 o'clock," said Tish firmly. "Any nurse who takes care of me eats 3 meals a day." Miss Lewis stood in the doorway with her cap over one ear and stared at Tish. And Tish glared back. "I prefer not," she said defiantly, giving her apron belt a twitch. "At 12 o'clock," Tish repeated, and then Miss Lewis gave it up. "Very well," she said unpleasantly. "Does it make any difference what I eat?" "None whatever. And now send me the Smith woman," said Tish calmly, "and shut the door. There's a draft." Miss Lewis slammed out, and whatever reason Tish had for wanting to get rid of her at noon, she deigned no explanation. In 10 minutes Miss Smith knocked at the door and came in. She looked tired, but cheerful. "Do you want me, Miss Carberry?" she asked. "If you are not busy," said Tish in her pleasantest manner. "Sit down, Miss Smith. Lizzie, Aggie, this is the Miss Smith I told you about. You will pardon the curiosity of three old women, won't you, Miss Smith, and answer a question or two about last night?" "Certainly." She looked surprised and, I fancied, amused. "In the first place," Tish asked, getting a pencil and sheet of letter paper from the table, "has any investigation been begun?" "I think not," said Miss Smith. "There are always queer goings on in a hospital, and besides, there has been a stir up in the management and things are at sixes and sevens. 2 interns left last night and the superintendent is pretty busy this morning." "Indeed," said Tish, and wrote something down. "Where is the body now?" "It went to the anatomical board this morning. He had no relatives and no money. If he isn't claimed in a certain time, he'll be sent to the college dissecting room." Aggie shuddered. "And now, Miss Smith," said Tish, leaning back in her roller chair, "would you mind telling me exactly what happened last night?" "Not at all," said Miss Smith, smiling. "We have a rule here that when a patient dies in one of the wards at night, the day nurses for that ward go with the body to the mortuary and prepare it for burial. The night nurse, having charge of several wards, cannot easily leave. I am in charge of K ward, and Miss Blake is my assistant." "She's not in K ward today," said Tish. "No, she is relieving the hall nurse here for her off duty. Miss Blake is not well, and this is lighter." "One moment," said Tish. "What is the K ward's night nurse's name?" "Miss Durand." "What time did Mr. Johnson die?" "Shortly after midnight. It was marked 12:10 on the record." "And you were called at once?" "I think not," Miss Smith said slowly. "It was nearly 1 o'clock." "Is that customary?" Tish demanded. "Not usually," said Miss Smith, "but it is not extraordinary either. The night nurse may have been giving a fever bath, or something else she could not leave." "You are very indulgent to the curiosity of 3 old women," Tish said with her pleasantest smile. "Will you be amiable a little longer and tell us what happened in the mortuary?" "Well, really, nothing happened to me. Dr. Grimm had seen Johnson and pronounced him dead. He had been called from the operating room to do it, although Johnson was a medical case. The night orderlies, Briggs and Marshall, took the body to the mortuary and waited with it until Miss Blake and I arrived." "Briggs and Marshall," Tish put down. "The lights were on and Briggs was smoking. We had a few words over that, because the orderlies are not allowed to smoke on duty, and tobacco makes my head ache." Tish leaned forward in her chair and looked at Miss Smith. "Do you often have words with the orderlies, Miss Smith?" Miss Smith smiled cheerfully. "Quite often," she said. "They're such a stupid lot." "You don't think it possible that these men may have retaliated by playing a practical joke on you?" Miss Smith considered. "No," she said, "I don't. When I found the linen closet up there locked and went downstairs for sheets, they were both at work in the wards. Anyhow, they might be willing to play a ghastly trick on me, but I don't think they would try to frighten Miss Blake. She's very well liked." "And after you went for the sheets?" "That's all I know, Miss Carberry. The rest you heard Miss Blake tell." "Are you sure?" Aggie broke in suddenly, leaning forward. "Are you sure, Miss Smith, that he didn't do it himself?" Miss Smith stared. "Why, he was dead, Miss Pilkington," she said. "He'd been sick for months. And if he was alive, as I am this minute, he couldn't hang himself by the neck, the way he was hanging, with nothing to stand on near or any chair kicked away. The center of the room was clear when we found him, and the nearest thing was the foot of the bed, a good 8 feet away. He was a spiritualist, I think." Yes, indeed," Miss Smith laughed. "It would have made you creepy to hear him lying there carrying on whole conversations with nobody near, and rap on his bed until the nurses balked at changing the sheets." Aggie shivered. "Gracious," she said. "I hope they don't send him back here for the dissecting room. I shan't be easy until he is safely buried." "Oh, you needn't worry about that," Miss Smith said cheerfully, getting up to go. "We wouldn't be likely to get all of him anyhow." "Well, as Tish said, She hadn't learned much she hadn't known before, except that Johnson had been left in the ward 50 minutes after he died, instead of 10. But although the people in the hospital seemed disposed to let the affair alone after sending the body away, and to get back to its business, which, as Miss Smith said, is full of curious things anyhow, Tish, as I say, having taken hold, was not going to let it go. Promptly at noon by the travelling clock, Miss Lewis having taken herself off, Tish lifted herself out of her wheelchair and reached for her cane. "You can stay here, Aggie," she said, "and if Lewis comes back, I'm seeing Lizzie to the elevator." "She won't believe a word of it," Aggie objected. "Then think of something she will believe. Lizzie is coming with me." I wasn't surprised when Tish turned to the left in the corridor and hobbled to the foot of a flight of stairs. She stopped there and turned. "We're going up to see that room in daylight, Lizzie," she said, "but I want you to read this first. You're a practical woman, and if any of your family ever grew a head of hair after they died, at least they don't brag about it." She took a page of the morning paper, folded small, from the sleeve of her dressing gown, and pointed to a paragraph. "Amos Johnson, once a well-known local medium, died last night at the Dunkirk hospital after a long illness. Johnson was 67 years of age and had lived in retirement and poverty since the murder of his wife some years ago, a crime for which he was tried and exonerated. The woman's body was found in the parlor of the Johnson home, hanging to a chandelier by a roller towel, knotted about the neck." Tish was watching me. "Well, what do you make of that, Lizzie?" she asked. "Coincidence," I said with affected calmness. "Many a man's hung his wife to something when he got tired of her, and when you come to think of it, a roller towel is usually handy." We didn't look at each other. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of The Amazing Adventures of Letitia Carberry by Mary Roberts Rinehart. The footprint on the wall. Well, Tish and I examined the room, and I must say at first sight it was disappointing. It was an ordinary hospital room with 2 windows and a bureau between them, a washstand, a single brass bed, set high and not made up, the pillows being piled in the center of the mattress and all covered with a sheet, and 2 chairs, a straight one and a rocker. Except that the heavy chandelier was bent somewhat from the perpendicular, there was no sign of what had happened there. Tish sat down in the rocker and looked thoughtfully about the room. "Under ordinary circumstances," she said, "if you hang a broadcloth skirt on a chandelier to brush it, you'll have the whole business and half the ceiling about your head in a minute. And yet look at that! Hardly bent." The room had evidently not been disturbed since Johnson had been found there. The straight chair had been drawn beneath the chandelier, and Tish pointed out the scratches made by the feet of whoever had cut down the body. Over the back of the chair still hung the roller towel, twisted into a grisly rope. Tish picked it up and examined it. "Pretty extravagant of material, aren't they?" she said. "No ladies' aid that I ever saw would put more than 2 yards of 12-cent stuff in a roller towel. Look at the weight of that, and the length." "There's something on it," I said, and we looked together. What we found were only 3 letters stamped in blue ink. "S.P.T.?" said Tish. "What in creation is S.P.T.?" She sat down with the towel in her hand, and we puzzled over it together. "It's the initials of the sewing circle that sent it in," I asserted. "That S stands for Society." "I've got it," said Tish. "Society for the Prevention of Tetanus." "That doesn't help much," I said. "We could find out by asking. I dare say the nurses know." But Tish wouldn't hear of it. She said the towel was the only clue we had, and she wasn't going to give it to a hospital full of people who didn't seem to care whether their corpses walked around at night or not. She rolled up the towel under her arm, and in the doorway she turned to take a final survey of the room. "Well," she said, "we haven't examined the dust with the microscope, but I think it's been worth while. It would be curious, Lizzie, if his murdered wife's initials were S.P.T. "They couldn't be," I said. "Her last name was Johnson, wasn't it?" But Tish wasn't looking at me. She was staring intently at the wall over the head of the bed, and I followed her eyes. The wall was grey, a dull grey below and a frieze of paler grey above. The dividing line between the two colors was not in a picture molding. The room had no pictures, but a narrow iron pipe, perhaps an inch in thickness, and painted the color of the frieze. Why a pipe I never asked, but I fancy its roundness, its lack of angles and lines, had been thought, like the grey walls, to be restful to the eyes. Directly over the head of the bed the pipe molding was loosened from the wall, as if by a powerful wrench, and sagged at least 4 inches. "Look at that," said Tish, pointing her cane. "Lizzie, I want you to help me up on the bureau." "I'll do nothing of the sort, Tish," I snapped. "You ought to be ashamed with that leg." But she had pulled out the lowest drawer and was standing on it by that time, and there wasn't anything for it but to help her up. She caught hold of the pipe molding between the windows and jerked at it. "I thought so," she said. "It doesn't give a hair's breadth. Lizzie, no picture ever pulled that molding down like that." Well, it was curious when you think about it. It's easy enough to read Mr. Conan Doyle's stories, knowing that no matter how puzzling the different clues seem to be, Mr. Doyle knows exactly what made them, and at the right time he'll let you into his secret. And you'll wonder why you never thought of the right explanation at the time. But it is different to have to work them out yourself, and to save my life I couldn't see anything to that bended pipe. But a bended pipe. Tish's next move was to crawl upon the bed, and that time I helped her willingly. She stood for quite a while, gazing at the pipe, with her nostrils twitching, steadying herself with one hand against the wall to put on her glasses with the other. She said. "I can't quite make it out. There are prints against the wall, just underneath, but it doesn't seem to be a hand." I got up beside her and we both looked. It was a hand, and it wasn't. It seemed like a long hand with short fingers. Tish leaned down and rubbed her hand on the headboard of the bed, which was dusty as she expected, and then pressed its imprint against the wall beside the other. They were alike, and they were different, and suddenly it came to me, and it made me dizzy. "I know what it is now, Tish," I said as calmly as I could. "That's the mark of a foot." Tish nodded. She'd seen it almost as soon as I had. "A foot," she repeated gravely, and we climbed off the bed in a hurry and went out into the hall. Tish had left her cane in her excitement, and she refused to go back for it alone. I went with her, finally, and we stood at the bottom of the bed and looked at the foot, with its toes pointed up towards the ceiling, and Tish's hand beside it. "You know, Lizzie," she said, clutching my arm, "if there were a fourth dimension, we could walk up walls easily." And we went down to her room again. It was careless of us to forget Tish's handprint on the wall, for when things got worse and they discovered the 2 marks, somebody suggested that no 2 hands make exactly the same print, and they had an expert take an impression of it. As Tish said, she expected to be discovered every time she had her pulse counted, and the strain was awful. They might have accused her, you know, of carrying off old Johnson and stringing him up, for they reached a state when they suspected everybody. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Amazing Adventures of Letitia Carberry by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When Aggie screamed. Now Aggie has hay fever, and the slightest excitement any time in the year starts her off. So when we heard her sneezing as we went down the stairs, we were not surprised to find Tommy Andrews in front of her with an order book on his knee, and Aggie trying to hold a glass thermometer in her mouth. "I can't," she was protesting around the thermometer. Just try sneezing yourself with a chew. Her teeth came down on it just then with a snap, and her face grew agonized. There, she said, what did I tell you? And pulled the thermometer out, minus an end. Where's the rest? Tommy demanded. I swallowed it. Tommy jumped up and looked frightened. Great heavens, it's glass, he said. What in thunder? Why, there it is in your lap. I swallowed the inside, Aggie said stiffly. I should think that's bad enough. It's poison, isn't it? Tommy laughed. It won't hurt you, he said. It's only quicksilver. But Aggie was only partly reassured. I dare say I'll be coated inside like the back of a mirror, she snapped. Between being frightened to death until I'm in a fever, and then swallowing the contents of a thermometer, and having it expand with the heat of my body and maybe blow up, I feel as though I'm on the border of the spirit land myself. In spite of Tommy's reassurances, she refused to be comforted and sat the rest of the afternoon waiting for something to happen. She ate no luncheon, and she absolutely refused to go home. Aggie is like most soft-mannered people. Trying to make her do something she doesn't want is like pounding a pillow. It seems to give way, and the next minute it's back where it was at first, and you can pound till your hands ache. So when she said she was going to stay at the hospital until she felt sure the mercury wasn't going to blow up or poison her, we had to yield. We got the room next to Tish's and put her to bed, and she lay there, alternately sneezing and sleeping the rest of the day. I went out during the afternoon and brought a nightgown for her, and one for myself, and the mentholated cotton wool for her nose. The walk did me good, and by the time I got back I was ready to sneer at footprints that go up a wall and Johnson hanging to a chandelier. As I left the elevator at Tish's door, I met Miss Linda Smith and stopped her. "Is there anything new?" I asked. "Nothing except that Miss Blake has been sent back to bed," she said. "She's a nervous little thing anyhow, and she has not been here very long. When she has had almost 3 years, as I have, she'll learn to let each day take care of itself. Not to worry about yesterday or expect anything of tomorrow." "And how about today?" I asked, smiling at the contradiction of her pessimistic speech and her cheerful face. "And to work like the deuce today," she said, and went smiling down the hall. I had brought in some pink roses, and when I'd put Aggie's nightgown on her and the wool in her nose, I had Miss Lewis take me to Miss Blake's room. It was close at hand. If you know the Dunkirk hospital, you know that the nurses' dormitory is directly beside the main building and connected with it by doors on every floor. One of these doors was at the end of Tish's corridor, and Miss Blake's room was the first on the other side. Miss Lewis knocked and tried the door, but it was bolted. "Who's there?" asked a startled voice, quite close, as if its owner had been standing just inside. "Miss Lewis, dear. Just a moment." She opened the door almost immediately and admitted us. She had on only her nightgown and slippers, and her hair was down in a thick braid. I have reached the time of life when I brush most of my hair by holding one end of it in my teeth, so I always notice hair. "You're up," said Miss Lewis accusingly. "Only to be sure the door was fastened," she protested, and got into her single bed again obediently. "Now don't be silly," Miss Lewis said. "Why should you lock that door in the middle of the afternoon? I thought you were the girl who rescued the kitten from the ridgepole of the roof." "That was different," said Miss Blake, and shut her eyes. "I don't want to disturb you," I said. "Only my friend and I felt sorry that she caused you such a shock last night, and I want you to have these flowers." She seemed much pleased, and Miss Lewis put them on the table by the bed, beside another bouquet already there, a huge bunch of violets and lilies of the valley. Violets and lilies of the valley are Tommy's favorite combination. "Dr. Andrews been here this afternoon?" Miss Lewis asked, looking up from arranging the roses. "Once, twice," said the little nurse with heightened color. "I see," said Miss Lewis. "And the husband of 36 telephoning all over the city for him." "The husband of 36?" I repeated, astounded. They both laughed, and Miss Blake looked for a moment almost gay. "He is not a Mormon," she said. "It's a case of container for the thing contained. 36 is a room." I think the laugh did the little nurse good, but when we left a few minutes later, Miss Lewis halted me a few steps from the door. We heard her cross the room quickly and the bolt of the door slip into place. "Queer, isn't it?" asked Miss Lewis. And I thought it was. Tommy Andrews came back late that night to see Aggie, but she had stopped sneezing and dropped into a doze. He beckoned me out into the hall. "How is she?" he asked. "Having been quicksilvered inside, I dare say she's been reflecting." "Never mind, Miss Lizzie. I couldn't help that." "Tish wants to see you, Tommy," I said. We found something this afternoon, and I don't mind saying we are puzzled." "More mystery?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. "Don't tell me somebody else has shed his fleshy garment and hung it up." "Please don't," I said, looking over my shoulder nervously. The hall was almost dark. "Look here," Tommy suggested in a whisper. "I'll make a bargain with you. I'll go in and listen to Aunt Tish without levity. I give you my word, no frivolity. If you'll come over and play propriety while I see Miss Blake." Seeing me eye him, he went on guiltily. "She's sick, you know, and I've been there 2 or 3 times today already. If it gets out among the nurses, please, dear, good Aunt Lizzie." Now, I'm not his aunt. For that matter, I'm a good 10 years younger than Tish. But he's a handsome young rascal, and when a woman gets too old to be influenced by good looks, it's because she's gone blind with age, so I agreed on one condition. "Yes, if you'll see Tish first," I said, and he agreed. That was how we happened to be in Tish's room when Aggie screamed. Tish had just got to the footprint on the wall part of her story, and even Tommy was looking rather queer, when Aggie sneezed. Then almost immediately she shrieked, and the 3 of us were on our feet and starting for the door before she stopped. As we reached the hall, a nurse was running toward us, and the stillness in Aggie's room was horrible. It was dark, which was strange, for I'd left the nightlight on at Aggie's request. Tommy pushed into the room first. "Where's the light switch?" he demanded. "Are you there, Miss Aggie?" There was no answer, but in the darkness everyone heard a peculiar rustling sound, such as might be made by rubbing a hand over a piece of stiff silk. It was the nurse who found the switch almost instantly, and I think we expected nothing less than Aggie hanging by her neck to the chandelier. But she was lying quietly in bed, in a dead faint. When she came to, she muttered something about a dead foot and fainted again. By 11 o'clock she seemed pretty much herself once more, and even smiled sheepishly when Tommy suggested that it had been the fault of the thermometer. She thought herself that she had dreamed it, and Tish and I let her think so. But both of us had seen the same thing. Just over the head of Aggie's bed, the pipe molding was wrenched loose and pulled down out of line. End of chapter 5.